Have you ever been in a situation where people treated you like you were invisible, like your existence meant nothing, only to discover that you held all the power the entire time? Well, let me tell you about the night that changed my life forever. The night when I finally found my voice after years of being silenced, dismissed, and treated like I was worthless in my own family. This is my story, and I'm sharing it because I know there are others out there who have felt what I felt, who have swallowed their pain and their truth because they were afraid of the consequences. I'm here to tell you that your voice matters, that you matter, and that sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who need to hear your truth the most. It was a Friday evening in late autumn, and the air had that crisp, cold quality that makes you want to wrap yourself in warm blankets and forget about the world outside. But there was no comfort waiting for me that night. No warmth in the house I'd walked into with my husband David for what was supposed to be a simple family dinner at his parents' house. I remember standing in the doorway, my hands trembling slightly as I held a homemade apple pie I'd spent hours perfecting, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I'd been married to David for 8 years, and in those 8 years, I'd attended countless family gatherings, each one chipping away at my self-esteem, each one leaving me feeling smaller and more insignificant than the last. David's family was wealthy, the kind of wealthy that comes with old money, prestigious connections, and an air of superiority that they wore like expensive perfume. His mother, Patricia, was a former socialite who still acted like she was the queen of high society, and his father, Richard, was a retired executive who spent most of his time playing golf at exclusive country clubs and reminding everyone about his accomplishments. Then there was David's younger sister, Caroline, who had inherited her mother's sharp tongue and her father's sense of entitlement, and his older brother, Marcus, who was a successful investment banker and never missed an opportunity to talk about his latest acquisition or business deal. I came from a completely different world, a world where money was tight, where my parents worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and where success meant having food on the table and a roof over your head. I'd worked my way through college, juggling part-time jobs and student loans, and I'd built a career for myself through sheer determination and countless sleepless nights. But none of that mattered to David's family because to them, I wasn't good enough. I would never be good enough. And they made sure I knew it every single time we were together. As I walked through that door on that fateful Friday evening, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, the same knot that always appeared when I knew I was about to spend hours being scrutinized, judged, and found lacking. Patricia greeted us at the door with her practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and she barely glanced at the pie I'd brought before ushering us into the living room where the rest of the family had already gathered. I could feel their eyes on me as I entered, assessing my outfit, my hair, my posture, looking for something to criticize, something to comment on in those subtle, cutting ways they'd perfected over the years. Caroline was perched on the edge of the sofa, her designer dress probably costing more than my entire wardrobe, and she gave me a once-over that made me feel like I was wearing rags. Marcus was standing by the fireplace with his wife Jennifer, who was just as polished and perfect as the rest of them, and Richard was in his leather armchair, already holding a glass of expensive scotch. The evening started the way it always did, with small talk that somehow always circled back to accomplishments, success, and status, 3 things that I apparently didn't possess in their eyes. Patricia had prepared an elaborate meal, the kind that required a professional caterer and cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and we all sat down at the dining table that could easily seat 12 people. I took my usual seat next to David, trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible, a skill I'd learned over the years because the less I said, the less ammunition they had against me. But that night, something was different. Something in the air felt charged, like a storm was brewing, and I was standing right in the center of it. The conversation flowed around me as we ate. Talk of Marcus's latest successful deal, Caroline's upcoming vacation to the French Riviera, and Patricia's charity event that was apparently the social event of the season. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, contributed the occasional comment when directly addressed, and tried to ignore the familiar feeling of being an outsider in what was supposed to be my own family. Then Caroline, emboldened by her second glass of wine, turned her attention directly to me with that predatory gleam in her eyes that I'd learned to recognize and dread. She asked me, in that sweet, poisonous tone she'd mastered, how my little job was going, emphasizing the word little, in a way that made it clear she didn't consider what I did to be a real career. I felt David tense beside me, but he said nothing. He never said anything, and that silence hurt more than any insult Caroline could throw at me. I took a deep breath, my hands gripping my napkin under the table, and I told her calmly that my work was going well, that I'd recently completed a challenging project and was proud of what I'd accomplished. But Caroline wasn't satisfied with my measured response. She never was, and she pressed on, asking me if I was still working at that tiny company, if I'd ever considered doing something more ambitious with my life, something that actually mattered. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully aimed to inflict maximum damage, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much her words hurt. Patricia joined in then, adding in her refined, cultured voice that she'd always wondered why I didn't aspire to something greater, why I seemed so content with mediocrity. And Richard nodded in agreement, making some comment about how in his day, people had drive and ambition. The whole family was looking at me now, waiting for my response, waiting to see if I would defend myself or if I would simply accept their judgment the way I always had. Have you ever felt so small, so worthless, that you wanted the ground to open up and swallow you whole? That's exactly how I felt in that moment, surrounded by people who should have been my family, but who treated me like I was a disappointment, like I was something to be ashamed of. The dinner continued, but the damage had been done, and I could feel myself retreating inward, building those protective walls around my heart that I'd constructed over years of similar encounters. Marcus chimed in with his own observations about ambition and success, using himself as the shining example of what determination could achieve, conveniently forgetting that he'd had every advantage handed to him on a silver platter, from his Ivy League education paid for by his parents to the connections that had launched his career. Jennifer nodded along enthusiastically, adding her own thoughts about how important it was to marry someone who matched your level of success and social standing, and I felt David's hand briefly touch mine under the table, a gesture that was supposed to be comforting but felt more like an apology for his family's behavior, an apology that I'd heard too many times before. The conversation shifted then, moving away from me and onto other topics, and I thought maybe I could just get through the rest of the evening without any more attacks, but I should have known better. As Patricia served dessert, some elaborate French pastry that she'd had specially ordered from a boutique bakery in the city, Caroline noticed the pie I'd brought sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. She asked loudly enough for everyone to hear what that was, pointing at my carefully crafted apple pie as if it were something offensive. Patricia glanced at it dismissively and said, "Oh, that's what she brought," emphasizing the word she in a way that made it clear I was separate from them, different, other. Caroline laughed, that cruel, tinkling laugh that I'd heard directed at me so many times, and said something about how quaint it was that I'd brought homemade pie to a dinner party, as if we were at some country potluck instead of a sophisticated gathering. The whole table found this amusing, and I sat there watching them laugh at my expense, feeling my face burn with humiliation, and my heart crack just a little bit more. David finally spoke up then, saying quietly that I'd worked hard on that pie and that everyone should at least try it, but his defense was half-hearted, weak, and it did nothing to stop the mockery. Richard made a joke about hoping I hadn't poisoned it, and they all laughed again, and I realized in that moment that I was completely alone, that even my own husband wouldn't truly stand up for me against his family's cruelty. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about needing to use the bathroom, and I practically ran from the dining room, my vision blurred with unshed tears, and my chest tight with emotion. I locked myself in the guest bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who looked defeated, broken, someone I barely recognized anymore. I'd let them diminish me, let them make me feel like I was less than, and I'd done it for years because I loved David and I wanted to keep the peace, because I'd convinced myself that their opinion didn't matter, that I could rise above their judgment. But standing there in that bathroom, with their laughter still echoing in my ears and their words still cutting into my soul, I realized that I couldn't do this anymore, that I couldn't keep sacrificing my dignity and self-worth for people who would never respect me, who would never see me as anything more than the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who'd somehow tricked their golden boy into marrying her. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the insults I'd endured, all the moments when I'd felt my spirit being crushed under the weight of their disapproval. I remembered the first time I'd met David's family, how nervous I'd been, how desperately I'd wanted them to like me, and how quickly that hope had been shattered by Patricia's cold assessment and Richard's dismissive attitude. I thought about my wedding day, which should have been one of the happiest days of my life but was overshadowed by Patricia's constant comments about how different everything would have been if David had married someone from their social circle, someone appropriate. I remembered every family holiday, every birthday celebration, every gathering where I'd been made to feel like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong and never would. The memories flooded through me, each one a small wound that had accumulated over the years until I was covered in scars that no one could see but that I felt every single day. I thought about my own family, about my parents who had worked so hard to give me opportunities they never had, who had taught me the value of kindness and hard work and integrity, and I felt a surge of anger on their behalf because David's family looked down on them too, considered them beneath their notice, unworthy of their time or respect. I thought about my career, the one they dismissed so easily, and I felt a fierce pride in what I'd accomplished, in the obstacles I'd overcome, in the person I'd become despite all the challenges life had thrown at me. I wasn't less than them. I wasn't inferior or inadequate or any of the things they'd tried to make me believe I was. And standing there in that bathroom, I made a decision that would change everything. I splashed cold water on my face, straightened my shoulders, and looked at my reflection with new determination. I'd spent 8 years trying to be good enough for people who would never accept me, 8 years shrinking myself to fit into their narrow definition of worthiness, and I was done. I was done pretending that their words didn't hurt, done apologizing for who I was and where I came from, done letting them treat me like I was nothing. I walked back to the dining room with my head held high, and when I entered, they were still sitting around the table, still chatting and laughing, completely unbothered by the pain they'd caused me, completely unaware that something fundamental had shifted inside me. I took my seat next to David, and he looked at me with concern, probably noticing the change in my demeanor, the steel in my spine that hadn't been there before. Patricia was in the middle of a story about some exclusive event she'd attended, and I let her finish before I spoke, my voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I said I had something to share with everyone, something I thought they should know, and the table fell silent, all eyes turning to me with various expressions of surprise and curiosity. Caroline had that smirk on her face, probably expecting me to announce something embarrassing or to apologize for my pie, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that what I was about to say would wipe that smirk right off her face. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each person, and I began to speak, my words measured and clear. I told them that I'd listened to their comments about my job, about my ambitions, about my worth, and I'd let them believe certain things about me because I thought it was easier that way, because I thought it would make things smoother with David's family if I just kept quiet about certain aspects of my life. But I was tired of keeping quiet. Tired of letting them think they were better than me, and it was time they knew the truth. I could see confusion on their faces now, uncertainty about where I was going with this, and I took a deep breath before dropping the bomb that would shatter their assumptions and change our family dynamic forever. I told them that the tiny company they'd mocked, the little job they'd dismissed, wasn't quite what they thought it was, and I watched as their expressions shifted from confusion to curiosity to shock, as I explained that I wasn't just an employee at that company, I was the founder and CEO, that I'd built it from the ground up over the past 10 years, starting while I was still in college and growing it into a multi-million-dollar business. The silence that followed was deafening, absolute, and I could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile what they'd assumed about me with this new reality. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot, because they needed to understand the full scope of their ignorance, the full extent of what they'd been so carelessly dismissing. I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, telling them about the contracts we held with major corporations, about the innovative solutions my team had developed, about the industry recognition we'd received, about the fact that my company had just been valued at over $50 million in our latest funding round. I watched their faces change, watched the realization dawn, watched the smugness and superiority drain away, to be replaced by shock and, in some cases, embarrassment. Caroline's mouth had literally fallen open. Marcus had gone pale. Patricia was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white, and Richard looked like someone had just told him the earth was flat. But the most important reaction, the one that cut me the deepest, was David's, because he was staring at me with this mixture of pride and guilt, knowing that he should have defended me, knowing that he'd let his family belittle his wife when he knew the truth about my success all along. I wasn't finished, though, because there was one more piece of information they needed to know, one more revelation that would make everything crystal clear. I took a breath and said, with perfect calm, that I'd kept the details of my business private from most people, including them, because I'd wanted to maintain some separation between my personal and professional life, but that they might be interested to know that my company had recently acquired Richard's former firm, the one he'd built his reputation on, the one he still bragged about at every opportunity. I let that sink in for a moment, watching as Richard's face went from pale to red, as the implications of what I just said became clear to everyone at the table. I explained in detail that the acquisition had been completed 3 months ago, that I'd been the one reviewing the financials and approving the deal, that technically speaking, I now signed the paychecks for the people who had taken over his legacy. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop, and I felt a sense of liberation washing over me, a feeling of finally being free from the weight of their judgment, finally standing in my truth without apology or shame. The atmosphere in that dining room had completely transformed, and I could see each family member grappling with this new information in their own way. Patricia, who had spent years looking down her nose at me, who had made countless comments about my lack of refinement and social standing, was now staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, and there was something in her eyes that might have been respect, or maybe just shock, I couldn't quite tell. Richard, whose entire identity was wrapped up in his business accomplishments and his career success, looked devastated, as if I'd personally attacked his legacy by acquiring his former company, though in reality, it had been a purely strategic business decision that had nothing to do with him personally. Marcus, the investment banker who had always treated me like I didn't understand the first thing about business or finance, was looking at me with new eyes, probably recalculating everything he thought he knew about me and realizing that I'd been operating at a level far beyond what he'd imagined. Caroline, who had been the most vocal in her mockery and dismissal of my career, had lost all her color and was opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, unable to form words. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, probably realizing that all those comments she'd made about marrying someone of equal status were now deeply ironic, given that I likely had more wealth and success than Marcus. And David, my husband, the man who should have known better, who should have protected me, who should have stood up for me long before tonight, was looking at me with this complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle, pride and guilt and maybe even a little fear about what this moment meant for our marriage. I felt a strange calmness wash over me, a sense of peace that came from finally speaking my truth, from finally refusing to shrink myself to make others comfortable, from finally claiming the respect I deserved instead of waiting for them to grant it to me. I thought about all the successful women I knew who hid their achievements to avoid threatening fragile egos, who downplayed their intelligence to make others feel smart, who dimmed their light so others could shine, and I realized that I'd been doing the same thing, that I'd been complicit in my own diminishment, but not anymore, not after tonight. Not after I'd seen the look on their faces when they realized they'd been wrong about me all along. I continued speaking, my voice steady and clear, explaining to them that I hadn't shared this information before because I'd wanted to keep my professional and personal lives separate, because I hadn't wanted my success to be the only thing that defined me in their eyes, because I'd hoped that eventually they would accept me for who I was as a person rather than what I had or didn't have. But their behavior tonight, their cruel dismissal of my hard work, their mockery of something I'd created with my own hands, had made it clear that they would never respect me unless they understood exactly what they were dismissing, exactly who they were judging, exactly what their assumptions had cost them. I told them about the journey I'd taken to build my company, about the 20-hour days and the countless rejections, about the times I'd wanted to give up but pushed through anyway, about the innovative idea I'd had in college that had become the foundation for everything I'd built. I explained how I'd bootstrapped the company in the beginning, working multiple jobs to fund it, how I'd hired my first employee when we were both working out of my tiny apartment, how we'd landed our first major client through sheer persistence and the quality of our work. I described the scaling process, the challenges of managing rapid growth, the tough decisions about hiring and firing, about partnerships and investments, about staying true to our mission while adapting to market demands. I talked about the sleepless nights wondering if we'd make payroll, about the exhilaration of closing major deals, about the responsibility of having hundreds of employees depending on me to make the right choices. And as I spoke, I watched their expressions continue to shift, watched them realize that while they'd been dismissing me as some sort of struggling underachiever, I'd been building something substantial, something impressive, something that would have earned their respect immediately if they'd known about it from the start. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I didn't hide the bitterness in my voice as I pointed out that their respect for me apparently depended entirely on my bank account and business success, that they couldn't value me as a person, couldn't appreciate my kindness or my integrity or my intelligence unless those qualities came packaged with financial achievement and social status. I looked directly at Patricia and asked her if she really believed that a person's worth was determined solely by their wealth and connections, if she truly thought that someone who came from a working-class background was inherently less valuable than someone born into privilege. I turned to Richard and asked him if he'd taught his children that money and status were the only things that mattered, if that was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. I looked at Caroline and asked her if it made her feel powerful to belittle others, if tearing people down was how she built herself up. And I looked at Marcus and asked him if he'd ever stopped to consider that there were different paths to success, that not everyone inherited their opportunities or their starting capital. The questions hung in the air, uncomfortable and challenging, and no one seemed to know how to respond. David finally found his voice and said my name quietly, apologetically, but I held up my hand to stop him because I wasn't finished. Because there were things that needed to be said, truths that had been buried for too long under layers of politeness and peacekeeping. I turned to my husband, the man I'd loved and supported and stood by for 8 years, and I told him that his silence had hurt me more than his family's insults ever could, that every time he'd sat quietly while they diminished me, while they made me feel small and worthless, he'd chosen them over me. He'd chosen his comfort over my dignity. I said that I understood family dynamics were complicated, that I knew he loved his parents and siblings, but that he'd made vows to me, promised to stand by my side, to honor and protect me, and he'd broken those promises every single time he'd let them treat me badly without consequence. I could see the pain in his eyes, the recognition of truth in what I was saying, and part of me felt guilty for calling him out so publicly. But a larger part of me knew that this conversation was long overdue, that our marriage couldn't survive if we continued to pretend everything was fine. I told him that I'd loved him enough to tolerate his family's behavior, to swallow my pride and my hurt, to keep showing up to these gatherings even though each one left me feeling worse about myself. But that love shouldn't require someone to accept abuse. That love shouldn't mean losing yourself in the process. I said that I'd reached my limit, that something had to change, that I needed him to choose me, truly choose me, even if that meant standing up to his family, even if that meant setting boundaries that might be uncomfortable. The room was incredibly tense now, charged with emotions that had been suppressed for years, and I could feel tears threatening to spill over, but I blinked them back because I wanted to finish what I'd started, wanted to say everything that needed to be said while I had the courage. I turned back to the rest of the family and told them that I hadn't shared this information tonight to prove anything to them, that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on their approval or their respect, but that I'd reached a point where I couldn't sit silently anymore while they treated me as less than. I said that I'd worked hard for everything I'd achieved, that I'd earned my success through determination and innovation and relentless effort, and that I was proud of where I came from and the journey I'd taken. I told them that my parents, whom they'd never bothered to get to know or respect, had taught me values that were far more important than the ones they seemed to hold, values like kindness and humility, and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their social status or bank account. I explained that I'd built a company that prioritized ethical business practices, that treated employees with respect and fairness, that contributed to communities and causes that mattered, and that I'd done all of this while maintaining my integrity, which was something I was far more proud of than the financial success. And then I said something that I knew would be hard for them to hear, but that needed to be said, which was that their obsession with wealth and status had made them cruel, had blinded them to the humanity in others, had turned them into the kind of people who valued appearances over substance, who measured worth in dollars instead of character. I watched their faces as I spoke, saw the defensive anger in some, the shame in others, the denial in a few, and I knew that my words were hitting home even if they didn't want to admit it. Patricia opened her mouth to respond, probably to defend herself and her family, but I wasn't finished yet and I kept speaking, my voice growing stronger with each word. I told them that I'd spent years trying to earn their acceptance, trying to prove that I was good enough to be part of their family, but that I'd finally realized that the problem wasn't me. It was them. It was their narrow view of the world and their inability to see value in anyone who didn't fit their specific mold. I said that I'd wasted so much energy worrying about what they thought of me, trying to please them, trying to be someone they might approve of, and in the process I'd lost sight of who I really was. I'd dimmed my own light. I'd made myself smaller to fit into their limited expectations. But I was done with that now. Done apologizing for my success, done hiding my achievements, done pretending that their opinion of me mattered more than my own opinion of myself. Have you ever experienced a moment where you finally stood up for yourself after years of accepting mistreatment, where you finally spoke your truth even though it was terrifying? If you have, please share your story in the comments below because I think it's so important for us to support each other in finding our voices and claiming our worth. The silence that followed my words was profound and heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and suppressed emotions, and I could see everyone at that table processing what I'd said in their own way, grappling with the reality that their assumptions about me had been completely wrong, that the person they'd dismissed and belittled for years was actually more successful than any of them had imagined. Richard was the first to attempt a response, clearing his throat awkwardly and saying something about how they'd had no idea, how if I'd just told them about my company, they would have treated me differently. And I felt a surge of anger at his words because that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? The fact that their respect for me was conditional, dependent on my achievements rather than inherent in my humanity, the fact that they needed proof of my worth before they could treat me with basic dignity and kindness. I told him as much, explained that the problem wasn't that I'd kept my business success private. The problem was that they'd assumed I was unsuccessful and had treated me accordingly, that they'd judged me based on superficial criteria and had never bothered to get to know who I really was beyond those surface judgments. I said that if I'd been working a minimum wage job, or if I'd chosen to be a stay-at-home parent, or if I'd pursued any other path in life, I would still deserve respect. I would still deserve to be treated with kindness. My worth as a human being would still be absolute and unchangeable. Patricia tried to interject, saying that they'd always been welcoming to me, that I was being dramatic and oversensitive, and I felt that familiar gaslighting attempt, that effort to make me doubt my own experiences and perceptions. But I wasn't falling for it anymore, not after everything I'd been through, not after years of accepting their version of reality over my own lived experience. I responded calmly but firmly, giving specific examples of their behavior, quoting comments they'd made, describing incidents they probably didn't even remember, because to them these were just casual remarks, throwaway comments. But to me, each one had been a small cut that accumulated into deep wounds. I reminded Patricia of the time she'd told me at a family gathering that David could have married anyone he wanted, implying clearly that I should be grateful he'd chosen me, as if I were somehow lucky to be with him rather than being an equal partner in our relationship. I brought up the Christmas when Caroline had given everyone expensive, thoughtful gifts, but had given me a gift card to a discount store, the message clear that I wasn't worth the same effort or expense as the other family members. I mentioned the countless times Richard had talked about the importance of coming from good stock and strong families, always with a pointed look in my direction that made it clear he didn't think I qualified. I recalled the family vacation they'd planned and paid for, inviting everyone except me, telling David he could bring a friend instead, as if I were interchangeable, as if our marriage meant nothing. Marcus jumped in then, trying to smooth things over, saying that maybe there had been some misunderstandings, some miscommunications, that they'd never intended to make me feel unwelcome or unvalued. But his words rang hollow because intent doesn't erase impact, because not meaning to hurt someone doesn't undo the pain you've caused, and I told him so. I explained that I'd given them the benefit of the doubt countless times, had made excuses for their behavior, had told myself that they didn't realize how their words and actions affected me, but that after years of the same patterns repeating, I couldn't pretend anymore that it was all just innocent misunderstanding. Their behavior had been consistent, deliberate, and clear in its message that I wasn't good enough for their family, and no amount of backpedaling now could change that history. Caroline, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up, her voice smaller than usual, less confident, and she said that she was sorry if she'd hurt my feelings, that she hadn't realized I was so sensitive, and I felt that flash of anger again because she was still putting the responsibility on me, still suggesting that the problem was my sensitivity rather than her cruelty. I looked at her directly and said that there was nothing wrong with being sensitive, that being affected by people's unkindness wasn't a character flaw, that in fact having empathy and emotional awareness was a strength, not a weakness. I told her that her apology would mean more if she actually acknowledged what she'd done wrong, if she could name specific instances where she'd been hurtful, if she could demonstrate that she understood the impact of her behavior rather than just dismissing it as me being too sensitive. The conversation continued, becoming increasingly raw and honest, peeling back layers of family dysfunction that had been hidden beneath a veneer of politeness and propriety for years. David was trying to mediate, to smooth things over, but I could see that he was struggling with his own guilt and shame, recognizing his role in enabling this dynamic, understanding that he'd failed to protect me from his family's cruelty. I felt a complex mixture of emotions toward him in that moment, love and disappointment intertwined, because I knew he was a good person who had been caught between loyalty to his family and loyalty to his wife, but that didn't excuse the choices he'd made, the times he'd stayed silent when he should have spoken up. Patricia attempted another defense, saying that they came from a different generation, that their values were different, that I should understand their perspective and not judge them so harshly. But I pushed back on that excuse too, explaining that basic kindness and respect for others transcends generations, that there's no era in human history where it was acceptable to treat people as less than based on their social or economic status, that using generational differences as an excuse for bad behavior was just another way of avoiding accountability. I said that I'd met plenty of people from their generation who were kind and inclusive and open-minded, who judged people based on their character rather than their bank account. So it wasn't about age or when they grew up. It was about choices they'd made and values they'd prioritized. Richard was getting visibly uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat, his face flushed, and he said something about how this had all gotten out of hand, how we were family and should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. But I wasn't ready to move forward, not yet. Not without making sure they truly understood what they'd done and what needed to change. I told him that moving forward without addressing the past just meant repeating the same patterns, that real change required acknowledgement and accountability, that I needed to know they understood how their behavior had affected me, and that they were committed to treating me differently going forward. I said that I wasn't asking for perfect relationships or pretending that family dynamics were ever easy, but I was insisting on basic respect and dignity, on being treated as an equal member of the family rather than an outsider who needed to constantly prove her worth. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could see that we'd reached a critical moment, a fork in the road where we would either find a way to rebuild these relationships on a foundation of mutual respect, or we would acknowledge that the damage was too deep to repair. Part of me felt guilty for disrupting the family peace, for creating this uncomfortable confrontation, for putting David in this difficult position. But a larger part of me felt liberated, empowered, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, because I was finally being authentic, finally refusing to accept mistreatment, finally standing up for myself even though it was hard and scary and potentially relationship ending. I thought about all the women I knew who stayed silent in similar situations, who endured disrespect from their in-laws or their partners' families because they didn't want to cause problems, because they'd been taught that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for themselves. I thought about how many people go through life accepting less than they deserve because they're afraid of being seen as difficult or demanding or ungrateful. And I thought about how I'd been one of those people for so long, how I'd prioritized everyone else's comfort over my own well-being, how I'd swallowed my pain and my anger and my hurt because I didn't want to be seen as the problem. But I wasn't the problem. Their behavior was the problem. And naming that truth out loud, claiming my right to be treated with respect, that wasn't causing a problem. That was refusing to accept one. Jennifer, who had been mostly silent throughout this entire exchange, spoke up then, surprising everyone. She said quietly that she'd witnessed the way the family treated me, that she'd felt uncomfortable with some of their comments, that she'd wanted to say something but hadn't known how. She apologized for her own silence, for not standing up for me when she should have, and I felt a small surge of gratitude because her acknowledgement meant something. Her willingness to admit her own complicity showed a level of self-awareness that the others seemed to lack. It gave me a tiny bit of hope that maybe change was possible, that maybe this painful confrontation could lead to something better. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted from defense and denial to a more genuine discussion about family dynamics, about expectations and assumptions, about the ways we hurt each other without even realizing it. Patricia, to her credit, finally admitted that she'd had concerns when David first introduced me, that she'd worried I was different from the women she'd imagined him with, and that those concerns had colored her interactions with me from the beginning. She said she'd been protective of her son, wanting to make sure he married someone who would fit into their world, and she hadn't given me a fair chance to prove myself beyond those initial judgments. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was a crack in her armor, an acknowledgement that her behavior hadn't been entirely justified. Richard followed suit, admitting that he'd been dismissive of my career because he hadn't understood what I did, that he'd made assumptions based on limited information, that his pride in his own achievements had made him blind to the accomplishments of others. Marcus acknowledged that he'd been competitive and condescending, that he'd used his success to feel superior to others, that he'd never stopped to consider how his words might impact me. Caroline was the last to offer anything resembling an apology, and hers was still defensive, still qualified with excuses, but she at least admitted that some of her comments had been unkind. I listened to each of them, weighing their words, trying to determine if they were offering genuine remorse or just saying what they thought I wanted to hear. I knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, that patterns established over 8 years wouldn't disappear after one difficult conversation. But I also knew that this was a start, that by refusing to accept their behavior anymore, I'd force them to at least acknowledge it existed. I told them that I appreciated their willingness to admit their mistakes, that I recognized how hard it could be to examine your own behavior, and acknowledge when you've hurt someone. But I also made it clear that words weren't enough, that I needed to see consistent changes in how they treated me, that rebuilding trust would take time and effort. I said that I wasn't asking them to pretend the past hadn't happened, but I was asking them to commit to doing better going forward, to treating me with the same respect and kindness they showed other family members, to making a genuine effort to get to know me as a person rather than judging me based on their preconceptions. And I told David, in front of his entire family, that I needed him to be my partner in this, to set and enforce boundaries with his family if necessary, to stand up for me even when it was uncomfortable, to choose our marriage over his desire to keep the peace. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and promised that he would do better, that he understood how badly he'd failed me, that he was committed to making changes. I wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because I loved him and I wanted our marriage to work, but I also knew that trust had to be earned back through actions, not just promises. The dinner party that was supposed to be a simple family gathering had turned into a watershed moment, a turning point that would define our relationships going forward. As the evening finally drew to a close, as people began gathering their things to leave, the atmosphere was different than it had been at the beginning of the night. There was discomfort, yes, but also a sense of something having shifted, something important having been addressed. Patricia walked me to the door, and for the first time in 8 years, she looked at me with something that might have been actual respect in her eyes. She said quietly that she hoped we could work on rebuilding our relationship, that she wanted to know me better, to understand what I'd built with my company. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Richard shook my hand formally, saying he'd been impressed by what I'd shared about the business acquisition, asking if we could have lunch sometime to discuss it further. Marcus gave me an awkward hug, admitting that he'd underestimated me, that he'd like to learn more about my work. Even Caroline managed a small smile and a genuine-sounding apology before she left. As David and I drove home that night, sitting in silence in the car, I felt emotionally exhausted but also lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a heavy burden for years and had finally set it down. The days and weeks that followed that dinner party were challenging in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, because confronting years of family dysfunction doesn't lead to instant resolution. It leads to a difficult process of learning new ways to relate to each other, of testing boundaries, of rebuilding trust that had been broken. Patricia called me a few days later, inviting me to lunch, just the two of us, and I was nervous accepting because our one-on-one interactions had always been particularly tense. But when we met at a quiet restaurant, something was different. She asked me about my business, really asked, not in the patronizing way she'd always inquired about my job before, but with genuine interest and curiosity. I found myself opening up to her, telling her about the challenges and rewards of entrepreneurship, about the innovative solutions my team had developed, about my vision for the company's future. And she listened, really listened, asking thoughtful questions, sharing some of her own experiences from her years in the social and philanthropic world. We didn't become best friends over that lunch, but we established a foundation for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than judgment and condescension. She even apologized more fully than she had at the dinner, acknowledging specific instances where she'd been unwelcoming or unkind, admitting that her own insecurities and protectiveness over David had made her unfair to me. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected, and I left that lunch feeling like maybe, just maybe, things could actually get better. David and I had several difficult conversations about his role in everything that had happened, about the ways he'd failed to protect me, about what needed to change in our marriage going forward. He was genuinely remorseful, understanding now how his silence had been a form of betrayal, how his desire to avoid conflict had come at the cost of my well-being. He started setting boundaries with his family that he'd never set before, calling out comments that were inappropriate, making it clear that he wouldn't tolerate any disrespect toward me. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments where he fell back into old patterns, but he was trying, and I could see the effort he was making. We started couples therapy to work through the damage that had been done and to build better communication patterns, and slowly, gradually, I felt our relationship beginning to heal. Marcus reached out professionally, expressing interest in some of the work my company was doing, and we ended up having several meetings where he actually treated me as an equal, as someone whose expertise and insight he valued. It was surreal after years of him talking down to me, but it also showed me how much people's perception of you can change when they see you as successful by their own metrics, which was both validating and depressing, because it reinforced that their respect had been conditional all along. Caroline took the longest to come around, still uncomfortable with the new dynamic, still struggling to reconcile the person she'd dismissed for years with the successful business owner I actually was. But even she made small efforts, sending me occasional text messages asking how I was doing, including me more genuinely in family conversations. The next family gathering was awkward, everyone walking on eggshells, hyper-aware of their words and actions in a way that felt forced and uncomfortable. But it was a necessary phase, a transitional period where old patterns were being broken and new ones were being established. Over time, as we continued to work on our relationships, things gradually became more natural, more authentic. They started asking me real questions about my life, my work, my interests, rather than making assumptions. They began to share more of themselves with me too, letting down some of their own walls and pretenses. I learned things about Richard's childhood that helped me understand his obsession with success and status, about Patricia's struggles in her own marriage and her fears about her children's futures, about Caroline's insecurities and her use of cruelty as a defense mechanism, about Marcus's pressure to live up to impossible expectations. Understanding their context didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me have more compassion for them as complex human beings, rather than seeing them as one-dimensional villains. And slowly, very slowly, we built something that resembled actual family relationships, still imperfect, still occasionally strained, but fundamentally different from what had come before. Looking back on that fateful dinner party now, months later, I have complex feelings about how everything unfolded. Part of me wishes I'd stood up for myself sooner, that I hadn't wasted 8 years trying to earn acceptance from people who weren't willing to give it. Part of me wonders if I could have handled the confrontation differently, in a way that was less explosive and painful. But mostly I feel grateful that I finally found my voice, that I finally stopped accepting mistreatment, that I finally claimed the respect I deserved. That night changed everything, not just in terms of how David's family treated me, but in how I saw myself. I realized that I'd been participating in my own diminishment, that by staying silent and accepting their judgment, I'd been telling myself on some level that maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't good enough. But I am good enough. I've always been good enough. And my worth has never been dependent on their approval or anyone else's. The experience taught me so much about boundaries, about the importance of standing up for yourself even when it's hard, about the difference between keeping the peace and sacrificing your dignity. It taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is to be honest about how you're being hurt, even if that honesty creates temporary discomfort or conflict. It taught me that people can change, that relationships can heal, but only if everyone involved is willing to acknowledge the problems and do the hard work of addressing them. And it taught me that my voice matters, that my truth matters, that I have every right to take up space and speak up and demand to be treated with respect. I think about all the people out there who are in similar situations, who are being dismissed or belittled or made to feel less than by their partners' families, by their colleagues, by people in their lives who should be building them up instead of tearing them down. I want you to know that you don't have to accept that treatment, that you deserve better, that standing up for yourself isn't selfish or dramatic or problematic. It's necessary and healthy and brave. I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by other people's perceptions of you, that you don't need anyone's permission to value yourself, that you are enough exactly as you are. And I want you to know that speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes, even when you're terrified of the consequences, can be the most powerful thing you ever do. That night at the dinner table, when I finally told David's family the truth about my success, when I signed their metaphorical checks by revealing that I'd acquired Richard's company, I wasn't just sharing information about my business. I was reclaiming my power. I was refusing to be diminished anymore. I was standing in my truth and demanding to be seen for who I really was. And that moment, as terrifying and uncomfortable as it was, became a turning point not just in my relationships with them, but in my relationship with myself. So if you're reading this, if you're watching this video, and you've ever felt invisible or worthless or like you don't matter, please hear me when I say that you do matter. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. Don't wait 8 years like I did. Don't swallow your pain to keep other people comfortable. Don't shrink yourself to fit into someone else's narrow definition of worthy. Stand up, speak up, take up space, and never apologize for being exactly who you are. Now I want to hear from you, because I know I'm not alone in this experience. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you or treated you as less than, only to be shocked when they learned the truth about who you really are? Have you ever had to stand up to family members or in-laws who didn't respect you? How did you find the courage to speak your truth, and what happened when you did? Please share your stories in the comments below, because I think it's so important for us to support each other and let each other know that we're not alone in these. struggles. Your experience matters, and someone else who's going through something similar might need to hear that they're not crazy, that their feelings are valid, that they have every right to demand respect. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart or made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, please hit that like button to let me know. Understanding content like this, understanding the importance of standing up for yourself and setting healthy boundaries can literally change your life. It changed mine. So please take a moment to really reflect on what you've heard here, on how it applies to your own life, on what changes you might need to make to honor yourself more fully. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more real, raw, honest accounts of people finding their voices and reclaiming their power, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales. We share stories that matter, stories that inspire, stories that remind you that you're not alone in whatever you're going through. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video, because trust me, you're going to want to hear what we have coming next. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, for being here. Your presence matters, your engagement matters, and I'm so grateful to be able to share this story with you. Remember, you are worthy of respect, you are worthy of love, you are worthy of being seen and heard and valued. Never let anyone make you forget that. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.